The last thing I remembered was the knife. Not the one I was holding. I wasn't holding anything. I was already dead. But I remembered the knife in my brother's hand, the way it glinted under the kitchen light, the way he smiled as he pressed it into my skin. I remembered the fur. The way they pulled it off me in strips. The way my own flesh felt cold and exposed after they'd peeled away the last piece of my coat. I remembered my sister-in-law, no, not my sister-in-law. The woman who'd stolen my body. Lily. She was sitting at the table, a bowl of steaming broth in front of her, and she was laughing. "This is the best meal I've ever had," she said, and she used my voice to say it. My voice. My lips. My hands lifting the spoon to my mouth. You know what? I never liked her anyway. She was so annoying. Always whining, always thinking she was better than everyone else. My brother, Ethan, sat down beside her. He reached over and patted her hand, my hand, with his own. "Don't worry about her. She's gone now. She can't bother you anymore." My fiancé, Nathan, was across the table. He was the one who'd done the carving. He was the one who'd known exactly where to cut to get the best pieces. He was the one who'd smiled when my blood soaked into the cutting board. "To new beginnings," he said, and he raised his glass. And they ate. They drank. They celebrated. And I floated above them, a ghost in the corner of the room, watching them consume the last traces of who I'd been. I opened my eyes. I was in my bed. My room. The same pale blue walls, the same white canopy over my head, the same soft sheets that smelled like lavender. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, warm and golden, like nothing terrible had ever happened. Like I hadn't died. Like I hadn't watched my own flesh being scraped into a pot. I sat up slowly. My hands were small and smooth, the hands of a teenager. No calluces, no scars. No knife marks. I pressed my palms together and felt the warmth of living skin. I was alive. I was young. I was back. And downstairs, I could hear voices. "Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you." It was a celebration. A party. A gathering of people who'd come to wish me well. I forced myself to get out of bed. I walked to the mirror and stared at my reflection. 18 years old. Fresh-faced. Innocent. The girl who hadn't yet learned to be careful. The girl who'd died because she trusted the wrong people. I found them in the living room. My parents were there, smiling and happy, their arms around each other. My father was holding a glass of champagne. My mother was wearing her favorite dress, the blue one with the lace collar. They looked so proud. But I knew what was coming. In my first life, they died in a car accident 3 months after my birthday. A tragic coincidence, the police called it. A freak accident. But I knew the truth, Ethan had arranged it. He'd needed them out of the way so he could take control of the family business. And I hadn't been able to warn them because I'd been too busy being dead. This time, I was going to change everything. My mother saw me first. "There she is. There's our birthday girl." She rushed over and wrapped me in a hug. I let her hold me. I let myself feel the warmth of her arms, the familiar scent of her perfume. This was real. This was safe. This was the moment I needed to protect. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," she whispered. "We love you so much." "I love you too, Mom." The party went on for a while. People came and went. Friends, relatives, business associates. They all smiled at me, wished me well, handed me gifts that I opened with mechanical politeness. I was there, but I wasn't really there. I was watching. Waiting. Because I knew what was coming. I knew that Ethan was going to arrive late. He always did. He wanted to make an entrance. He wanted everyone to see how generous he was, how thoughtful, how devoted to his little sister. And he was going to bring a gift. A small, adorable, perfectly innocent-looking gift. I found my parents near the buffet table, and I took a moment to talk to them alone. "Mom, Dad," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "I need to tell you something important. And I need you to listen without interrupting." My father raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. My mother nodded, her expression shifting to one of concern. Ethan is not who you think he is, I said. I know that sounds crazy, but I'm telling you the truth. He's been planning something. He's been working with Nathan and someone named Lily. They've been setting things up for months. My mother started to speak, but I held up my hand. I can't tell you everything right now, I continued. I don't have enough time. But I need you to trust me. I need you to be careful. And I need you to promise me that you won't go anywhere near the car for the next 3 months. My father looked confused. Vera, what are you talking about? Please, Dad. Just promise me. He looked at my mother. She looked at him. And then, slowly, they both nodded. Of course, sweetheart, my mother said. If it's that important to you, we'll do it. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But I knew that this was just the first step. The hardest part was still to come. The doorbell rang. And I knew, even before they opened the door, who it was. Ethan walked in with a smile on his face and a box in his hands. Nathan was behind him, looking as polished and perfect as ever. They both looked so handsome, so charming, so utterly convincing. Happy birthday, little sister. Ethan called out, crossing the room to where I was standing. I'm sorry I'm late. Business ran a little long. He leaned in and kissed my cheek. I forced myself not to flinch. I brought you a present, he continued. I think you're going to love it. He opened the box. Inside was a small white dog. A Pomeranian, I realized. Not a Maltese like in my first life, but something close enough. Small and fluffy and adorable, with big dark eyes and a pink tongue that lolled out of its mouth. She's a show dog, Nathan said, stepping forward. Ethan spent months looking for the perfect one. He wanted to give you something that would make you happy. The dog looked up at me and wagged its tail. I looked at the dog. And I remembered. I remembered the way it had looked at me in my first life, the dark, knowing gaze, the way it seemed to watch me when I was sleeping. I remembered the bite marks on my hand, the way it had torn into my flesh with a strength that no dog that small should have had. I remembered the moment I realized that it wasn't a dog at all, it was Lily, trapped inside an animal's body, waiting for the chance to take mine. I remembered the knife and the skin and the broth. I remembered the laughter. It's perfect, I said, forcing a smile onto my face. Thank you, Ethan. Thank you so much. I reached into the box and pulled the dog out. It squirmed in my hands, and I could feel its tiny heart beating against my palm. It was small and warm and fragile. It was also the most dangerous thing I'd ever held. Her name is Sugar, Ethan said. I thought it was fitting. Because she's sweet, just like you. I looked at the dog. I looked at my brother. I looked at my fiancé. And I smiled. Thank you, I said again. I'm going to take such good care of her. I was. Just not the way they thought. I spent the rest of the party holding the dog, petting it, cooing at it. Everyone thought I was delighted. Everyone thought I was overjoyed. They didn't know that I was already planning. When the last guest left, I excused myself and went up to my room. The dog was still in my arms. It had stopped squirming and was watching me with dark, knowing eyes. Hi, Lily, I whispered. I know it's you in there. The dog's eyes widened. Its body went still. I don't know how you did it, I continued. I don't know how you got your soul into this dog's body. But I know what you're planning. And I'm not going to let it happen. The dog bared its teeth. I laughed. Don't worry, I said. I'm not going to hurt you. Not yet. I'm going to give you exactly what you want, a chance to be close to me. But it's not going to work out the way you planned. The dog growled. Sure, I said, stroking its head. It's okay. You're going to be just fine. It was a lie. But the dog didn't know that. The next morning, I made a phone call. Hello. Is this the dog breeding facility? Yes, How can I help you? I have a dog. A show-quality Pomeranian. I want to have her bred. There was a pause. Of course, We have a wide selection of studs available. I don't want a selection, I interrupted. I want you to breed her with the biggest, ugliest, most aggressive dogs you have. And I want you to do it as soon as possible. I'm not sure. Does the money matter to you? Another pause. I'm listening. I told him the amount. He stopped hesitating. Bring her in tomorrow, he said. I'll take care of everything. I hung up the phone and looked at the dog, which was growling at me from the corner of the room. Don't worry, I said. You're going to be a mother soon. Isn't that what you always wanted? The dog lunged at me. I stepped aside and let it crash into the wall. I didn't keep the dog in my room. The first night, I locked her in the bathroom. I heard her scratching at the door, whining, barking, trying to get out. I ignored it. She was used to being treated like royalty, I guessed. She'd gotten used to sleeping on silk pillows and eating a 5-wagyu. Not anymore. I hooked her to a heavy chain I'd bought from the hardware store and attached it to the bathroom pipe. She couldn't move more than 3 feet in any direction. She couldn't reach the door. She couldn't reach anything but her water bowl and a cheap bed I'd bought at the dollar store. And her food. I'd replaced the expensive dog food Ethan had brought with the cheapest kibble I could find, the kind that was mostly corn and byproducts, the kind that made dogs fat and sick and lazy. I dumped a bowl of it in front of her and watched her turn up her nose. Suit yourself, I said. You'll eat when you're hungry. She glared at me with those dark, knowing eyes. I knew she understood every word I was saying. I knew she was trapped in there, helpless and furious. I also knew she was planning her revenge. I just had to be faster. Ethan called the next morning. How's Sugar doing? He asked. His voice was carefully casual, but I could hear the tension underneath. He was worried. He was always worried about her. Great, I said. She's eating well. Sleeping well. I think she loves it here. You're not feeding her the cheap stuff, are you? I laughed. Of course not, Ethan. She's a show dog. I know how to take care of her. He was silent for a moment. Then, Vera, she's really important to me. I know she's just a dog, but she's special. I need you to take good care of her. I will, I promised. I hung up and looked at the dog. She was still glaring at me. Your boyfriend is worried about you, I said. He's so sweet. She growled. I laughed and walked away. The first thing I did was set up cameras. I'd ordered them online the night before, paid for express shipping, and installed them before anyone else woke up. There was one in my room, one in the hallway, one in the kitchen, and one in the living room. I wanted to see everything. I wanted to know exactly what was happening in my house. The second thing I did was investigate Brenda. Brenda was the housekeeper Ethan had hired. She was supposed to clean the house, cook the meals, and take care of the dog. She was supposed to be a stranger, just a woman who needed a job. I knew she was more than that. I just needed to prove it. I went through her application, her references, her personal information. Everything looked normal on the surface. She'd worked for several families, all of them wealthy, all of them satisfied with her work. She had good reviews and a clean record. But I knew better. I hired a private investigator, a man named Mr. Chen, who'd worked for my father for years. He was discreet, efficient, and loyal. He could find out anything. What do you need? He asked. Everything, I said. I need to know who Brenda really is. I need to know where she came from. I need to know who she's connected to. I'll have something in 3 days. Good. While I waited, I worked on the dog. I fed her the cheap kibble. She refused to eat it. I didn't care. She'd eat when she was hungry enough. I bathed her in cold water. I brushed her fur with a cheap brush that pulled at her skin. I put her in the yard with no shade and watched her pant in the sun. I was trying to break her. And I could see, just barely, the cracks starting to form. Mr. Chen called on the 3rd day. I have what you asked for, he said. Brenda's real name is Brenda Holloway. She's 48 years old. She grew up in the city, had a child when she was 19, and gave the baby up for adoption. I felt my heart race. Who did she give the baby to? A family named Miller. The baby was adopted by a couple named Richard and Nancy Miller. They lived in the same city, had no children of their own, and raised the baby as their own. And the baby? Who is it? Mr. Chen was silent for a moment. The baby was named Ethan Miller. He was adopted at birth and raised by the Millers. But when he was 12, his mother died, and his father remarried a woman named Emily. Emily was the one who sent him to live with your father. She told him he was your father's biological son. I felt the world tilt around me. So he's not my father's son. According to the records, no. Your father and Brenda never had a relationship. But your father agreed to take Ethan in to protect his brother's reputation. The brother was the one who was involved with Brenda. He died before Ethan was born, and your father felt responsible. I sat down heavily. It made sense now. All of it. Ethan's bitterness, his resentment, his desperate need to prove himself. He'd grown up believing he was the rightful son, the firstborn, the one who deserved everything. But he wasn't. He was just a pawn. And he'd been played. What about Brenda? I asked. Is she still in contact with him? Yes. She's been in contact with him for years. She was the one who suggested he should try to claim your family's money. I closed my eyes. And Lily? She's Brenda's other child. The one she had after she gave Ethan up. She raised Lily on her own, mostly. Her husband was in prison. She's the one who orchestrated Lily's adoption into your family. I opened my eyes. So Lily is Ethan's half-sister? Yes. And they were planning this together? Yes. I believe so. I thanked Mr. Chen and hung up. I had everything I needed. The next morning, I took the dog to the breeding facility. I'd been preparing for this. I'd made sure Ethan was out of town. I'd made sure Brenda was busy with other tasks. I'd packed the dog into a carrier and driven to the facility before anyone could stop me. The facility was a run-down building on the outskirts of town. It smelled like wet fur and dirt and desperation. The dogs inside were thin and aggressive, their eyes wild with hunger and fear. This is the place, the owner said. He was a balding man with yellow teeth and a smile that never reached his eyes. Now, about your dog. Use her, I said. Use her with whatever you have. Make sure she gets pregnant. I don't care how many times. The owner looked at the dog, then at me. She's small. She might not survive if we use the bigger ones. She's strong, I said. She'll survive. The owner shrugged. Your choice. I handed him an envelope of cash and walked away. Behind me, I heard the dog whimpering. It was the last time I'd hear her make a sound like that. I got the call the next day. Your dog did well, the owner said. She's pregnant. Probably with multiple puppies. We'll know for sure in a few weeks. I smiled. Good. Take care of her. One more thing, he said. She's been acting strange since the procedure. She's been growling at the other dogs, trying to bite them. We had to separate her. I'm not surprised, I said. She's always been aggressive. I hung up and looked at the fake pendant in my hand. I'd made it myself, using a cheap stone and some wire. It looked like the real thing, close enough that no one would notice the difference, especially at night. The real pendant was in my pocket. I was going to give the fake one to Brenda. She deserved to think she was winning. It was a week before Brenda noticed the dog was gone. She'd been too busy with other things, cleaning, cooking, running errands. She hadn't noticed that Sugar wasn't in her room, wasn't in her bed, wasn't anywhere in the house. But eventually, she did. Where's Sugar? She asked, her voice sharp with panic. I shrugged. I don't know. She disappeared last night. I thought she might have gotten out. She can't have gotten out. The doors were locked. I guess she found a way. Brenda's face went pale. She started searching the house, calling the dog's name, checking every room. I watched her from the window, smiling. She had no idea what was coming. It was 3 weeks before Ethan found out. He'd been out of town, handling business, trying to stay one step ahead of me. He thought he'd been careful. He thought he'd been clever. He hadn't been careful enough. "Where's Sugar?" he demanded, bursting into my room without knocking. "I came back and she's not here. Brenda told me she's been gone for weeks." I looked up from my book. "I don't know. She disappeared. I thought she might have gotten out." "She can't have gotten out. The doors were locked. I guess she found a way." Ethan's face went red with anger. "You're lying. I know you're lying. Where is she?" I smiled. "I don't know what you're talking about." Ethan grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my skin. "Tell me where she is. Now." "I don't know," I repeated. "But I do know something else." "What?" "Brenda's been using your mother's name to get money from you. She's been telling you that she knows things about your past, about your inheritance. She's been lying to you for years." Ethan's grip loosened. "What?" "She's not who you think she is. She's been manipulating you since the beginning. She's been using you to get close to our family." Ethan stared at me, his eyes wide with shock. "You've been played," I said. "And now, you're going to lose everything." I pulled my arm free and walked out of the room. Behind me, I heard him calling my name. It was a satisfying sound. The month crawled by. I spent it watching, waiting, preparing. I kept the cameras running, documented every conversation, every suspicious glance, every moment that might be useful later. I stayed away from Ethan and Nathan as much as possible, making excuses, avoiding their questions. They were getting nervous. I could see it in the way they looked at me, the way they whispered to each other when they thought I wasn't listening. They were waiting for something. And I knew exactly what it was. 2 weeks before the deadline, Nathan cornered me in the hallway. His face was flushed, his eyes darting around like he was afraid of being overheard. He grabbed my arm and pulled me into the empty study. "Vera," he said, his voice tight with forced calm. "We need to talk." "About what?" "About the pendant." He reached out and touched the fake pendant around my neck. I'd been wearing it every day, just like he'd told me to. "You've been wearing it, right? Every day." "Of course," I said. "You told me not to take it off." "And you haven't." "Not once." He let out a breath, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "Good. That's good. What's so important about this pendant, Nathan?" He hesitated. For a moment, I thought he might actually tell me the truth. I could see the struggle in his eyes, the war between his loyalty to Lily and whatever was left of his conscience. Then he smiled. It was a practiced smile, the one he used when he was lying. "It's just a family heirloom," he said. "My grandmother gave it to me before she died. She said it would protect the person who wore it. I wanted you to have it." "To protect me?" "Yes." "From what?" He didn't answer. He just smiled again and walked away. The day before the deadline, Ethan came to my room. He was carrying a small box. He looked nervous, his hands shaking slightly, his eyes darting around the room like he was looking for something. "Vera," he said, "I have something for you." "What is it?" He opened the box. Inside was a small vial filled with something dark and viscous. It smelled like old blood and rotting flowers. "It's a gift," he said. "Something to help you sleep." "I don't need help sleeping." "Just take it, Vera. You'll feel better." I stared at him. I knew what was in that vial. In my first life, he'd given me something similar the night before the switch. He'd told me it would help me relax, help me dream, help me feel at peace. I'd drunk it. And I'd woken up in a dog's body. "Okay," I said. "I'll take it tonight before bed." Ethan smiled. It was the same practiced smile as Nathan's, the one he used when he thought he'd won. "Good girl," he said. "I'll see you tomorrow." I didn't drink the vial. I poured it down the sink and washed the glass carefully, leaving no trace. Then I went to bed and pretended to sleep. At midnight, I heard footsteps outside my door. I lay still, my eyes closed, my breathing slow and even. I heard the door creak open. I heard someone cross the room. I heard them stop beside my bed. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then I felt a hand on my cheek, cold and clammy. I heard a voice whisper my name. Vera. Vera, can you hear me? I didn't move. Vera, it's time. It's time to let go. You need to let go. The voice was familiar, but I couldn't place it. It was distorted, like it was coming from underwater, like it was being filtered through something thick and dark. I kept my eyes closed. Vera, the voice said again. It's time to give it all away. Give it to me. Give me your body. Give me your life. Give me everything. The hand moved from my cheek to my forehead. I felt something cold and wet pressing against my skin. A liquid. The same liquid from the vial. I didn't move. I let her do it. I let her believe she was winning. Because I knew something she didn't. I'd switched the pendants. The one around her neck was the real one. The one around my neck was the fake. And now, whatever magic she was trying to work was going to backfire. The next morning, I woke up in my own body. I stretched, yawned, sat up in bed. I felt a little groggy, a little tired, but otherwise fine. And then I heard the scream. It came from the other side of the house, high and sharp and full of shock. I smiled. I knew exactly who it was. I got dressed slowly, taking my time, letting the panic build. By the time I made it to the guest room, there was a crowd gathered outside. Ethan was there, his face pale, his hands shaking. Nathan was there, looking like he was about to be sick. And Brenda, well, Brenda was screaming. Get away from me. Get away. I pushed through the crowd and looked inside the room. Brenda was standing in front of the mirror, her hands pressed against the glass, her face contorted with horror. She was wearing a nightgown. She'd been sleeping, I guessed, but the person staring back at her wasn't the person she'd gone to sleep as. What did you do to Emmy? She screamed. What did you do? I walked into the room slowly, calmly. Good morning, Lily, I said. She spun around, her eyes wide with shock. You, her voice cracked. You did this. You did this to me. I just gave you what you wanted, I said. You wanted my body. You wanted my life. But you got something better. You got your mother's. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. No, that's not true. That's not how it was supposed to happen. I smiled. I know. You were supposed to get my body. You were supposed to kill me and take everything I had. But I switched the pendants, Lily. The one you've been wearing for the past month was the real one. The one I've been wearing was a fake. She stared at me, her face a mask of disbelief. So now, I continued, all that magic, all that work, all that planning, it went into your body. Not mine. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Congratulations, Lily, I said. You just got exactly what you deserved. Ethan burst into the room, his face twisted with rage. Vera, what did you do? I gave her what she wanted, Ethan. She wanted to be someone else. So now she's someone else. He lunged for me, but I was ready. I stepped aside and let him crash into the mirror, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. Vera, he said, his voice low and dangerous. You don't understand what you've done. You've ruined everything. On the contrary, I said. I've fixed everything. I walked out of the room and left them all behind. The next few weeks were chaotic. Brenda, or Lily, or whoever she was now, refused to leave her room. She couldn't look at herself in the mirror. She couldn't stand to be around other people. She was trapped in a body that wasn't hers, a body that was twice her age and worn down by years of hard living. Ethan tried to fix it. He consulted experts, searched for answers, tried every possible way to reverse what had happened. It was no use. The magic was irreversible. I heard him crying at night sometimes, alone in his room, mourning the sister he'd lost. I didn't feel sorry for him. He'd made his choices. He'd chosen to be cruel. Now he was living with the consequences. Nathan stopped coming around. I heard he'd moved to another city, started a new life, tried to forget everything that had happened. He never contacted me again. I didn't care. He'd chosen to be part of the plot to destroy me. He'd chosen to hurt me, to use me, to betray me. He was just as guilty as the rest of them. My parents came home at the end of the month. They'd extended their trip, just like I'd asked them to. They'd avoided the accident that had killed them in my first life. They were safe. Vera, my mother said, pulling me into a hug. We missed you so much. I missed you too, Mom. We heard there was some trouble with Ethan, my father said carefully. Is everything okay? Everything's fine, I said. He's just dealing with some personal issues. My parents exchanged a look but didn't push further. I was glad. There was so much I couldn't tell them, about the magic, about the pendant, about the horrible things their son and his friends had done. It was better to keep it to myself. Some secrets were better left buried. The last time I saw Lily, or Brenda, or whoever she was now, was at a coffee shop on the edge of town. She was sitting alone, staring out the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. She looked smaller than I remembered, older, more worn down. I sat down across from her. Lily, I said. She looked up, her eyes red and swollen. What do you want? I came to say goodbye. Goodbye. I nodded. I'm leaving. I'm going to college. I'm going to start a new life. And I'm never coming back. She stared at me for a long moment. Then she laughed, a bitter, broken sound. You win, she said. You got everything you wanted. I didn't want any of this, I said. I just wanted to survive. I stood up and walked away without looking back. A few weeks later, I heard that Lily had died. It was a heart attack, they said. Stress. Grief. The body couldn't handle the strain of everything that had happened. I didn't go to the funeral. I didn't feel like I needed to. She'd been a part of my past, a dark part, a part one was ready to leave behind. I didn't need to say goodbye to her one more time. She was gone. And I was free. The day my father came home, everything changed. He'd been away for weeks, handling business, tying up loose ends. I'd told him everything, all of it. The dog, the pendant, the magic, the plot to kill me and take my body. He'd listened without interrupting, his face growing darker with every word. Now he was back. And he was ready to end this. Vera, he said, finding me in the garden. I need to talk to you. I followed him into his study. The room was dark, the curtains drawn, the only light coming from a single lamp on his desk. He sat down heavily, his face lined with exhaustion and grief. I've been doing some research, he said. About Ethan. About his mother. About everything. I waited. Ethan is not my son. I already knew this, but hearing him say it out loud was different. There was a finality to it, a sense of closing a door that had been open for too long. He's my brother's son, my father continued. My younger brother. He died before Ethan was born. He was involved with Brenda when he was young. She got pregnant, and he promised to take care of her. But he died before he could. So you took responsibility. I didn't want to. I didn't love her. I never loved her. But I felt responsible. My brother had been a good man, and I wanted to honor his memory. So I took Ethan in. I raised him as my own. I gave him everything I could. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. And he repaid me by trying to destroy my family. By trying to kill my daughter. I reached over and took his hand. It's not your fault, Dad. You were trying to do the right thing. I know. But that doesn't change what he did. Ethan was called into the study that evening. He looked nervous, his eyes darting around the room, his hands shaking slightly. He knew something was wrong. He just didn't know what. Ethan, my father said. I need to tell you something. What is it? About your mother. About your real mother. Ethan's face went pale. What are you talking about? I'm not your father, Ethan. I've never been your father. Your real father was my brother. He died before you were born. I took you in because I felt responsible for him. Ethan stared at him, his mouth hanging open. That's not true. You're lying. I have the DNA test results. I have the birth certificate. I have everything you need to prove it. Ethan grabbed the papers and scanned them, his face growing paler with every line. Why? He said finally. Why would you lie to me? Because I wanted to protect you. Because I wanted to give you a chance at a good life. Because I thought, he stopped, shaking his head. I thought I was doing the right thing. Ethan laughed, a bitter, broken sound. You thought you were doing the right thing. You took me in out of pity. You gave me a name out of guilt. You never loved me. You never saw me as your son. I did love you, Ethan. I still do. But I can't love what you've become. Ethan stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned and walked out of the room. He never came back. Nathan's family came to me a few weeks later. They'd heard about the scandal, about Ethan's fall from grace, about everything that had happened. They wanted to talk, to negotiate, to find a way to salvage their reputation. I refused to meet with them. Tell them I'm not interested, I said to the messenger. Tell them I have nothing to say to them. Vera, please, Nathan's mother begged, appearing at my door. Nathan was wrong. He made mistakes. But we're family. You're not my family, I said. You never were. And I'm done pretending otherwise. She left, her face crumpled with grief. I didn't feel sorry for her. She'd known what her son was planning. She'd known about the magic, the dog, the pendant. She'd been part of it, just like the rest of them. She deserved everything she got. The business collapsed soon after. Without the backing of my family, Nathan's father couldn't keep their company afloat. The debts piled up. The investors pulled out. The bank called in their loans. I heard they'd lost everything. The house, the cars, all the money they'd stolen over the years. They were living in a small apartment on the wrong side of town, struggling to make ends meet. Nathan tried to contact me, to apologize, to explain. I blocked his number. He didn't deserve my forgiveness. Ethan disappeared for a while. I heard rumors that he'd moved to another city, started a new life, tried to forget everything that had happened. I didn't believe it. People like him didn't just start over. They carried their mistakes with them, always. I didn't try to find him. I didn't need to. He was gone. And I was free. The last person to leave was Lily. She'd been living in Brenda's body for weeks now, and it was killing her. The body was old and sick and worn down by years of hard living. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't keep anything down. I visited her once, in the hospital. She was lying in a bed, her face pale and drawn, her eyes sunken. She looked like a ghost, like a shadow of the person she'd once been. Vera, she said, her voice weak and thin. You came. I wanted to see you. Why? Because I wanted to say goodbye. She laughed, a small, bitter sound. You don't have to do this. You don't have to pretend to care about me. Maybe not. But I wanted to tell you one thing. What? You were right about me. I was weak. I was naive. I trusted people I shouldn't have. But I'm not that person anymore. I survived. I'm going to live. And you're going to die. Her face twisted with rage. You're a monster. Maybe. But I'm a monster who's going to survive. I turned and walked away. Lily died a few weeks later. I didn't go to the funeral. I didn't send flowers. I didn't do anything to mark the occasion. She was gone. And I was still here. The day I left for college, my parents came to see me off. They were both crying, trying to hide it, trying to be brave. My mother hugged me for a long time, her arms wrapped around me like she was afraid to let go. Promise me you'll be careful, she said. Promise me you'll take care of yourself. I promise, Mom. Promise me you'll call. I'll call every week. She pulled back and looked at me, her eyes red and swollen. We're so proud of you, Vera. So proud. I know, Mom. I love you. I got on the plane and sat by the window. As we took off, I watched the city shrink beneath me, growing smaller and smaller until it was just a blur of lights and roads. I was leaving behind everything I'd known, everything I'd survived, everything that had tried to destroy me. But I wasn't running away. I was moving forward. I closed my eyes and smiled. I was finally free. Extra, the man who lost everything. Ethan left the city on a Tuesday. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't say goodbye. He just packed a bag, got in his car, and drove until the familiar streets became unfamiliar, until the signs changed to names he didn't recognize, until he couldn't find his way back even if he wanted to. He ended up in a small town on the coast. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where strangers were noticed, where people asked too many questions. He rented a room above a diner, paid cash, and told the landlord he was a writer looking for peace and quiet. It was a lie, of course. He'd never written anything in his life. But it was a convenient lie, the kind that kept people from prying. The first few weeks were the hardest. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, Vera's face, the one he'd tried to destroy, the one he'd failed to destroy. He saw the dog's eyes, dark and knowing. He saw Lily's face, twisted with rage and desperation. He saw his mother's face. The real one. Brenda. The woman who'd given him up, then come back, then used him like a tool. And he saw the look on his father's face. No, not his father. The man who'd raised him. The man who'd lied to him for years. He saw the disappointment, the grief, the final closing of a door that had never really been open. He couldn't eat. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't do anything but sit in his rented room and stare at the walls and try to remember who he'd been before all of this. He couldn't remember. The first person to find him was Nathan. It was a rainy afternoon, the kind that made everything grey and shapeless. Ethan was sitting in the diner, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold, when the door opened and Nathan walked in. Nathan looked different, thinner, paler, his eyes hollow. He sat down across from Ethan without asking. "I heard you were here," Nathan said. "How?" "Your father. He told me." "He's not my father. He's the closest thing you've got." Ethan didn't respond. He didn't have anything to say. "Listen," Nathan said, leaning forward. "I know you don't want to talk to me. I know you probably hate me. But I came here to tell you something." "What?" "I'm sorry." Ethan looked up at him. "You're sorry?" "I'm sorry for everything. For the lies, the manipulation, the way we treated Vera. I was wrong. I knew I was wrong, and I did it anyway. And now I'm paying for it." Ethan laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "You think that makes it better? You think saying sorry changes anything?" "It doesn't change anything," Nathan said. "I know that. I just wanted you to know." Nathan left after that. He didn't say where he was going or what he was planning. Ethan never saw him again. A few weeks later, Ethan heard that Nathan's family had lost everything. The business was gone, the money was gone, the house was gone. They were living in a small apartment on the wrong side of town, struggling to make ends meet. Ethan didn't feel sorry for Nathan. He didn't feel sorry for anyone. He was too busy feeling sorry for himself. The months passed. Ethan stayed in the small coastal town, working odd jobs, keeping to himself. He didn't make friends. He didn't want to. He just wanted to be left alone. But the memories followed him everywhere. He couldn't walk down the street without seeing Vera's face. He couldn't sleep without dreaming of the dog, the pendant, the moment everything had gone wrong. He started drinking. At first, it was just a glass of whiskey at the end of the night. Then it was 2. Then 3. Then the whole bottle. He'd wake up on the floor, his head pounding, his body aching, and he'd swear he was going to stop. But he never did. The news about Lily came in the spring. He heard it from a stranger, a woman who'd known Brenda years ago. She'd heard that Brenda had died, a heart attack, they said. She'd been living in the city, alone and bitter, and she'd just stopped. Ethan didn't know how to feel about that. He'd never really known Lily. He'd never really known any of them. He'd just been using them, the way they'd been using him. He'd thought he was the one in control. He'd thought he was the smart one, the clever one, the one who'd get everything he deserved. He'd been wrong. He'd been wrong about everything. The last time Ethan saw Vera was from a distance. He'd gone back to the city for a day, just to see the old neighborhood, just to remind himself of what he'd lost. He was standing on a street corner, watching the people pass, when he saw her. She was getting out of a car, laughing at something her friend had said. She looked different, older, more confident, more alive. She was wearing a dress that suited her, carrying a bag that looked expensive. She looked like someone who'd made it. She looked like she was happy. He stood there for a long moment, watching her walk away. He wanted to call out to her, to say something, to make her look at him just once. But he couldn't find his voice. And even if he could, he knew there was nothing left to say. That night, Ethan sat in his rented room and stared at the wall. He'd finished the bottle of whiskey. He'd finished another one after that. He was drunk, but not drunk enough to forget. He thought about Vera. He thought about Lily. He thought about his mother and the man who'd raised him and all the lies he'd told himself over the years. And he thought about the dog. That little white dog, trembling in the corner of the breeding facility. The one he'd chosen so carefully, so deliberately, so cruelly. He'd thought it was just a tool. A means to an end. Something he could use and discard without a second thought. But it wasn't just a tool. It was a living thing. A creature he'd betrayed, the same way he'd betrayed everyone else. He thought about the dog's eyes, dark and knowing. He thought about the way it had looked at him, trusting, loyal. He thought about the way he'd betrayed that trust. He didn't know why it was the dog that finally broke him. Maybe because the dog was innocent. Maybe because it was the only creature in his life that had never asked for anything. He didn't know. All he knew was that, at some point in the night, he started crying. He couldn't stop. The next morning, Ethan packed his bag and left the small coastal town. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't know what he was going to do. He just knew he couldn't stay there. He drove for hours, heading north, toward the mountains. The road was empty and quiet, the only sound the hum of the engine and the wind through the trees. He kept driving until the gas ran out, until the car shuddered to a stop on the side of the road. He got out and looked around. There was nothing but trees and sky and silence. He'd run out of road. He'd run out of places to hide. He sat down on the ground and waited. They found him a few days later. A hiker discovered his car, then his body. The police said it was a heart attack, a natural death. They said he'd been gone for a while, that he'd probably been dead for days before anyone found him. No one came to claim his body. No one came to say goodbye. He was buried in a small cemetery in the middle of nowhere, under a headstone that didn't have a name. It was a fitting end for a man who'd spent his whole life trying to be someone he wasn't. Vera heard about his death a few weeks later. She didn't cry. She didn't feel sad. She just felt a strange sense of closure, like a door that had been open for too long had finally swung shut. She thought about the dog sometimes, about the pendant, about all the things she'd survived. She thought about the people who'd tried to destroy her and how they'd ended up destroying themselves. And she felt grateful. Not for the pain, not for the suffering, but for the chance to start over. For the chance to be someone new. She closed her eyes and let the memory of Ethan fade away. He was gone. And she was still here. Extra 2, the day she let it go. The first year of college was harder than I'd expected. Not because of the classes, I was smart enough to handle those. Not because of the social scene, I'd learned to be charming when I needed to be. But because of the silence. The endless, oppressive quiet that came with being alone. I'd spent so long fighting, planning, surviving, that I didn't know how to just live. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I could hear the dog scratching at my door. I'd reach for my phone, ready to check the cameras, ready to make sure no one was coming for me. I'd have to remind myself every time that it was over. That they were gone. That I was safe. It took me months to stop flinching at the sound of footsteps. It took me even longer to stop looking over my shoulder. My roommate was a girl named Maya. She was from a small town in the Midwest, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and the biggest scandal was someone's cousin getting caught shoplifting. She was kind, loud, and completely unaware of the darkness I carried. She tried to be my friend. She invited me to parties, to study groups, to late-night talks in the dorm room. She told me about her high school sweetheart, her parents' divorce, her dream of becoming a veterinarian. I listened. I nodded. I smiled. But I never told her anything about myself. I couldn't. How do you explain to someone that you've died? That you've watched your own body being carved up and eaten? That you've spent months planning to destroy the people who tried to take everything from you? You don't. You let them think you're just a quiet girl with a complicated past. The first time I cried after leaving home was in a bathroom stall on the 3rd floor of the library. I don't even remember what triggered it. Maybe it was a song on the radio. Maybe it was a stray dog I saw on the street. Maybe it was just the weight of everything I'd been carrying for so long, finally too heavy to hold. I sat on the floor, my back against the cold tile wall, and I sobbed. I cried for the dog. I cried for Lily. I cried for Ethan, even though he didn't deserve it. I cried for the girl I used to be, the trusting, naive girl who'd thought she was loved. And then I stopped. I washed my face. I straightened my clothes. I walked out of the bathroom and went back to my life. Because that was what survivors did. They kept going. Maya found me on the quad a few days later. You look different, she said, tilting her head like a curious bird. Different how? I don't know. Lighter, maybe. Like something heavy fell off. I smiled. Maybe it did. She didn't ask what it was. She just nodded and said, well, whatever it was, good riddance. I started therapy in my 2nd semester. I'd been resistant at first, convinced I didn't need it, convinced I could handle everything on my own. But the nightmares kept coming, and the insomnia was getting worse, and I was starting to feel like I was falling apart. The therapist was a kind woman named Dr. Chen. She was patient and gentle, and she didn't push. She let me talk at my own pace, in my own time. Tell me about the dog, she said one day. I tensed. What about it? Whatever you want to tell me. I thought about the dog. The white fur, the dark eyes, the way it had looked at me with such hatred and desperation. I killed it, I said. Not directly. But I set it up so someone else did. Dr. Chen nodded. How do you feel about that? Mostly, I feel like I made the right choice. But sometimes, I stopped, swallowed hard. Sometimes I feel guilty. Guilty. Because she was trapped in there. Because she was desperate. She didn't want to be a dog. She didn't want any of this. She was just trying to survive, the same way I was. Dr. Chen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Vera, the choices we make in difficult circumstances aren't always black and white. You can regret the outcome of a choice without regretting the choice itself. I know. Do you? I looked at her. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Then I said, I'm trying to. I went back to the old neighborhood once, during winter break. I hadn't planned to. I'd just been walking, letting my feet carry me wherever they wanted to go, and they'd brought me here. The house looked different. Smaller. More worn down. The garden I'd helped my mother plant was overgrown, the fence was sagging, the windows were dark. I stood on the sidewalk and looked at it. I thought about all the things that had happened inside that house. The love, the lies, the betrayal. The moment I'd died and the moment I'd come back to life. And I thought about the girl I'd been, the one who'd trusted too easily, loved too openly, believed too much. I didn't feel sorry for her. She'd been young and naive, but she'd also been brave. She'd fought for her life. She'd survived. I turned away from the house and walked home. I never went back. The last time I thought about Lily was on a summer evening, years later. I was sitting on the balcony of my apartment, watching the sun set over the city. I'd graduated, found a job, made a life for myself. I was happy, not in the frantic, desperate way I'd been when I was fighting to survive, but in the calm, steady way that came from knowing I was safe. I thought about Lily and felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no regret. Just a quiet acceptance that she'd been part of my story, and that chapter was over. I raised my glass to the setting sun. Rest in peace, I said. Wherever you are. The next morning, I got a letter. It was from my mother, written on flowered stationery. She told me about the garden, the new neighbors, the stray cat that had adopted them. She told me she loved me and missed me and was proud of me. I read the letter 3 times and smiled. I was home, even when I wasn't there. The dog still appears in my dreams sometimes. But now, when I see her, she's not angry. She's just there, watching, waiting. And then she fades away. I think that's what healing looks like. Not forgetting, not forgiving, just letting go. And I've finally learned how to do that. End of Extra 2.